Git is probably the most popular source control system in the world. It's used by millions of developers, powers some of the biggest software projects ever made, and it's become the default recommendation for almost every new programmer. However, if you were to ask me, some of the colleagues I've worked with, or a number of other professional game studios what they're using and would recommend, they're probably going to say something other than Git. Because, as it turns out, Git wasn't really designed for the way games are built. It was designed mostly to just handle versioning of source code and other text files, and while there are solutions in place, such as LFS for dealing with binary assets, it's frankly still a tool that's been designed by programmers for programmers. And games are built by far more people than just programmers. Game development is inherently multidisciplinary. It's not uncommon for a project to have artists, designers, animators, audio engineers, and producers all contributing to the same repository. And unfortunately, out of the box, Git expects you to understand how version control works. Some of you watching this are probably programmers or solo developers, and if that's the case, you may have never experienced the pain of running into a merge conflict while working on a team, only to lose an entire day trying to untangle Git's quirks and get everything working again. Personally, I've tried just about every Git client out there, and while they all make the day-to-day experience a little nicer, they still inherit many of Git's underlying limitations. They don't make merge conflicts disappear easily, most don't have built-in support for proper file locking, and they're still built around workflows that can be difficult for artists, designers, and other non-programmers to navigate. That's fine if you're building a small project with a handful of developers, but on a game that's been in development for years with hundreds of thousands of files and a multidisciplinary team all working together, those limitations start to become very real. And that's exactly why I was interested when Anchorpoint reached out to me about partnering on this video. Rather than requiring you to completely change your workflow, Anchorpoint adds many of the features that game developers have come to rely on from non-Git-based tools, making Git a much easier sell for game development teams. Because the reality is, sometimes you don't have a choice. Maybe your studio already uses Git, maybe your team is already invested in that workflow, or maybe just switching source control isn't realistic for your project. So in this video, we're going to take a look at some of the biggest pain points with Git for game development and how Anchorpoint helps solve them. For me, the biggest issue with Git for game development is that it was built around the idea that multiple people could work on the same files and merge their changes together. But that's not really how game assets work. If two programmers modify the same C# script, Git can often figure out how to combine those changes. But if two artists modify the same Photoshop file, Blender file, or Unity scene, there's usually no way to easily merge that. I know some of you absolute mad lads out there have workflows that have made this work, and fair play to you, but for most artists and designers, this quickly becomes a headache that a studio just can't afford to spend time dealing with. And this is where Anchorpoint brings some of that game development focused workflow to Git. If you're working on a file in Unity, you can configure Anchorpoint to automatically lock that file based on its extension. Then, when another user tries to edit that same file, they'll be able to see someone else is working on it, and it'll stop them from being able to edit it right there in your engine. Once you're finished, you can check in your changes and release the lock, or discard them if you decide you don't want to keep them. And if you're in the middle of a big refactor, Anchorpoint can lock thousands of files in less than a second, so you don't need to worry about someone trying to work on any of the files you're in the process of changing. If you're working with other team members and you've never used file checkouts or locks before, I highly recommend giving them a try. For certain types of game assets, they can be an absolute productivity game changer. Another big issue that you'll regularly run into is how Git's workflows frequently contradict how a multidisciplinary team like to work. Most programmers understand concepts like staging files, committing changes, pulling updates, and resolving conflicts. But those concepts don't always map naturally to how artists, designers, and other team members like to think about their work. On top of that, these team members often don't need to access every single file in the repository. An artist might only care about the characters and environment assets that they're working on, while a designer might only need access to certain tools or spreadsheets in the project. Anchorpoint helps solve both of these problems by providing a simplified workflow for different roles on the team. Team members can choose to only download and work with the parts of the project that they actually need, so programmers don't need to pull hundreds of gigabytes of source art files, and artists don't need to fill their local folders with thousands of files they'll never open. It also removes some of the complexity of Git's workflow by handling things like merges and conflicts in a more user-friendly way. More on that a little later in the video. Another nice improvement is that Anchorpoint removes the concept of staging. Instead, Anchorpoint automatically stages your files and commits them, which in my opinion is a much easier way to work. The whole staging thing has always been a huge grievance of Git for me, and I can't tell you how many times I've forgotten to submit work I've staged, so that's definitely something I appreciate. On top of that, the Anchorpoint client adds some really useful art-focused features like version previews for assets, including PSD files, as well as the ability to mention team members and leave comments on check-ins. These kind of features make reviewing work an iterating with a team much easier. In games, source control shouldn't just be a tool programmers use to manage code. It should be a tool the entire team can comfortably use. And that's really where these features that Anchorpoint brings to the table start to make a difference, because they help bridge the gap between Git's traditional developer-focused workflow and the kind of workflows that game teams have come to expect from more specialized source control tools. And whether you're working in a team or not, once you've been developing a game for years, simply finding the assets you need can become a challenge. A small code project might have a few hundred files that are relatively easy to navigate, but a game that's been in development for a year or two can easily have thousands, if not tens of thousands, of assets spread across the project. And at this point, you might be dealing with hundreds of gigabytes worth of data, which is often one of the biggest friction points of a Git client. They don't usually scale super well with lots of binary files. Thankfully though, Anchorpoint has been tested to work on huge repos of over a terabyte in size, making it super reliable for the various types of files you'll find in a game project. But here's the next thing with that. Sometimes you just want a quick overview of your assets or an easy way to find the thing you're missing. To Git, a C# script, a Photoshop file, and a 3D model are all just files sitting in a folder, but game developers often need more context than that, and manually digging through huge folder structures every time can become pretty cumbersome. This is where Anchorpoint adds yet another layer on top of Git, its visual asset browser. Now obviously Git already has a way to search through a repository, but if you're trying to find that fence asset you made a year ago and you can't remember exactly what you named it, a simple text search is only going to get you so far. With the visual asset browser, you can search and browse your project in a much more visual way. You can preview things like 3D models, textures, and audio files directly inside the client, making it much easier to find the asset you're actually looking for. The other advantage is that you don't need to open the Unity editor just to find something. You can browse your assets directly through Anchorpoint, which can save a lot of time when you're working with large projects where opening the editor itself may last several minutes. You can also view file history and previous versions directly, which is especially useful for art assets. If someone changes the model or texture, you can see what actually changed visually rather than trying to interpret a difference between two binary files. Anchorpoint also gives you a central place to see which files are currently locked by other team members, so rather than discovering someone else has been editing a file when you try to make a change, you can see a current state of the project at a glance and know who's exactly working on what. Additionally, with the selective checkout feature, you can choose to only download and work on a subfolder of the repository, which if you've got a pretty art-heavy repo and don't care about the various source files, can allow you to avoid pulling them down and only work in the areas of the project you care about. A repeat theme that you might be noticing here is that game development has different needs from traditional software development. For code, a lot of useful information can live inside the files themselves, but for game assets, having tools to browse, preview, and understand those files becomes incredibly important as a project grows. Now, so far, we've mostly talked about the problems Git creates for artists, designers, and non-programmers. But even if you're a programmer who is comfortable using Git, there are still plenty of situations where it can become frustrating. Git, incredibly powerful, but it's also complex, and so when something goes wrong, understanding exactly what happened can sometimes feel like you need to be a Git wizard. Merge conflicts are probably the most obvious example. Personally, this is always one of the biggest pain points for me when using Git. When two people modify the same files, Git does its best to help you resolve those conflicts, but sometimes the solution isn't obvious, especially when you're dealing with large game projects and files that aren't simple text. Then you have things like branching, rebasing, and managing Git LFS. These are all incredibly useful features, but they're extra concepts that every member of your team needs to understand correctly to avoid problems. Anchorpoint solves a lot of these complexities by adding a layer of abstraction onto Git. Instead of forcing you and everyone else on your team to understand every single detail of a Git-based workflow, it helps guide you through these situations and handles a lot of the complexity behind the scenes. It helps you through pushing files if newer ones are on the server, an interactive rebase state, and any potential issues with submodules. And if something does go wrong, rather than leaving you staring at a cryptic error message like most Git clients, Anchorpoint provides clear explanation of what's been happening and what you need to do next to resolve it. And with things like locking between branches and merge warnings, it also helps you try to avoid conflicts before they happen. The knowledge required to use Git effectively doesn't always scale across an entire game team, and so being able to reduce that friction means that you and your team are able to spend more time actually making the game instead of fighting your version control tool. And as an additional way to reduce friction between tools, Anchorpoint includes a number of different plugins for a variety of everyday game-making tools such as Blender, Unity, Unreal, and even Jira. So yes, you can link your commits to Jira tickets and maybe, just maybe, keep Jira synced up with your bug fixing sprint for real this time. And ultimately, that's the common theme with all of these features. Anchorpoint is making Git work better for the way game teams actually build games. Because the reality is that modern game development is complicated. You have programmers, artists, designers, producers, and external collaborators all working together, and your source control needs to support all of those people. And honestly, this is why I've historically been pretty critical of using Git for game development. A lot of the frustrations I've had with Git in the past are because the default workflow doesn't include many of the features that make game development smoother. The things I've always appreciated about more game-focused most source control solutions are features like file locking, better asset management, and workflows designed around the way entire game teams work. And that's what's impressed me about Anchorpoint. It brings many of those same benefits into a Git workflow, meaning that you don't have to completely change your team's tools or throw away years of existing history just to get a better experience. Now, does this mean everyone needs to immediately move away from default Git? Absolutely not. If Git is working well for you or your team, that's great. But if you're running into the problems we've talked about in this video, having tools that make those problems easier to manage can make a huge difference. Not only does Anchorpoint seem to solve many of the pain points we've already discussed with Git, but if you do run into any issues, they have a dedicated support service for Git workflows with fast response times. So if that sounds like something you or your team could benefit from, I'd highly suggest checking Anchorpoint out. You can scan the QR code on screen now, or use the link in the description down below to learn more. That's it for now. A huge thank you to Anchorpoint for sponsoring this video. It's great to finally have something for folks working in games committed to a Git workflow that I can now point towards. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again next time.